Professor Veltar adjusted his 4 optical sensors and tried to ignore the fact that his third stomach was cramping with anxiety. Teaching advanced xenobiology at the Galactic Academy was supposed to be prestigious, not an exercise in preventing interspecies incidents, especially when one of those species happened to be human. Today, class, we will be examining a Class 12 Deathworld predator, he announced, his voice carrying that particular tone that suggested everyone should probably start writing their wills. The electromagnetic field around his cranial ridge flickered orange, which any first-year student knew meant extreme caution was required. The reaction was immediate and predictable. Zix, the Glorbonian student who looked like someone had crossed a jellyfish with a panic attack, began rapidly changing colors from purple to a sickly yellow-green. His gelatinous form quivered as he whispered, "Did he just say, Class 12? Are we actually going to die today?" Kor, the Thrakarian warrior scholar whose species had conquered half the Andromeda spiral through sheer stubbornness and really thick skulls, shifted uncomfortably in his reinforced chair. Even his impressive horn-plated forehead couldn't hide the fact that he was reconsidering his life choices. "Professor," he rumbled in his bass voice that usually intimidated everyone within 3 sectors, "perhaps we should start with something less likely to result in our immediate consumption?" And then there was Marcus Thompson, the human, who was currently unwrapping what appeared to be a sandwich made of at least 7 different types of processed meat, and something that might have been cheese but could also have been industrial lubricant. He took a bite, chewed thoughtfully, and raised his hand. "Yeah, quick question," Mark said, somehow managing to sound both interested and completely unbothered by the prospect of imminent death. "Are we going to be able to pet it? Because that would be pretty neat." The classroom fell silent. Even the environmental system seemed to pause in horror. Professor Veltar's optical sensors focused on the human with the kind of intensity usually reserved for examining particularly dangerous explosive devices. "I beg your pardon?" "The predator thing?" Mark clarified, taking another bite of his questionable sandwich. "Can we pet it? I mean, if we're studying it up close anyway, might as well make friends, right?" Zix made a sound like air escaping from a deflating balloon. "He wants to make friends with a Class 12 Deathworld predator," he whimpered. "We're sharing a classroom with an actual psychopath." "Mr. Thompson," Professor Veltar began, his voice taking on the careful tone one might use when explaining to a small child why they shouldn't juggle plasma grenades. "Class 12 Deathworld predators are designated as such because they possess the capability to terminate most known forms of sentient life within moments of contact. They are not, as you put it, for petting." Mark shrugged and wrapped up the remaining half of his sandwich for later. "Yeah, but like, everything's dangerous until you figure out how to not make it angry, right? I mean, that's basically how civilization works." The other students in the class, a mix of species from across the galaxy, all turned to stare at the human with the kind of fascinated horror usually reserved for watching someone walk into an active volcano while humming show tunes. Professor Veltar decided that perhaps early retirement wasn't such a terrible idea after all. Professor Veltar activated the containment field around his desk and reached for what appeared to be a heavily reinforced transport case marked with enough warning symbols to decorate a small moon. His hands trembled slightly as he entered the 17-digit security code, submitted to the retinal scan, and waited for the biometric verification to complete. "Now, class," he said, his voice dropping to what he probably thought was a reassuring whisper but sounded more like someone trying to talk their way past a nervous bomb squad. "I want everyone to remain perfectly still, no sudden movements, no loud noises, and absolutely no attempts at communication with the specimen." The case opened with a hiss of escaping atmosphere that made everyone except Mark flinch backward. Even Kor, whose species regularly wrestled with creatures that could bench press a small asteroid, looked like he was calculating the exact distance to the nearest exit. Professor Veltar reached into the case with the kind of careful precision usually reserved for diffusing antimatter explosives, and slowly, reverently, lifted out the most terrifying predator in known space. It was an orange tabby cat, slightly overweight, wearing a little collar with a bell on it. The silence that followed was the kind of profound quiet that usually preceded either enlightenment or complete psychological breakdown. "Oh my God," Mark said, his face lighting up like someone had just told him Christmas was getting moved to every Tuesday. "You got a cat, what's his name? He's adorable." Zix made a sound like a deflating whoopee cushion and promptly fainted, his gelatinous form spreading across the floor like purple jello. Professor Veltar caught him with one of his auxiliary appendages without even looking, clearly having dealt with fainting students before. Core, meanwhile, was backing away from his desk with the kind of careful, measured movements that suggested he was trying very hard not to trigger any predatory chase instincts. "That," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "is the most horrifying thing I've ever seen." 3 other students quietly filed out of the classroom, presumably to update their insurance policies and say goodbye to their loved ones. The cat, completely oblivious to the terror it was inspiring, sat down on Professor Veltar's desk and began licking its paw with the kind of methodical precision that the aliens were probably interpreting as ritual preparation for mass slaughter. Mark, however, was making little kissing sounds and wiggling his fingers. "Psst, psst, psst," he called softly. "Here, kitty kitty." The cat stopped licking its paw and looked at him with mild interest. The purring that followed made everyone except Mark assume they were hearing some kind of organic death rattle. Professor Veltar cleared his throat and tried to regain some semblance of academic dignity, despite the fact that half his class had either fainted or fled, and the other half looked like they were attending their own funeral. "As you can observe," he began, his voice only slightly higher than usual, "this specimen exhibits the classic characteristics of a Terran apex stalker." The cat yawned and stretched, displaying what Professor Veltar clearly considered to be its most terrifying feature. "Note the retractable claws," he continued, pointing with a trembling appendage at the cat's paws. "These organic blades can extend instantly to deliver devastating lacerations to prey." "Oh yeah," Mark chimed in cheerfully, "those are super handy. They use them for climbing and gripping and stuff. Some cats have extra toes, too. We call those murder mittens. Way cuter." Core made a sound like a steam pipe bursting. "Murder mittens," he repeated faintly. "This specimen also possesses enhanced optical organs designed for nocturnal hunting," Professor Veltar pressed on, clearly determined to salvage some educational value from this disaster. "Darkness means nothing to this creature. It can stalk and eliminate targets in complete absence of light." "Yep," Mark nodded, still making little kissy noises at the cat. "Pretty much all cats can see in the dark. Super useful for 3 a.m. zoomies. That's when they run around the house like maniacs for no reason. Usually right when you're trying to sleep." Zix, who had recently regained consciousness and was now clinging to the ceiling with his suction cups, whimpered. "They hunt while their victims sleep?" "Oh, they hunt all the time," Mark said casually. "That's like their whole thing. They're basically serial killers but fuzzy. They don't even eat most of what they catch. They just kill it for fun and then bring it to you as a present. My sister's cat once left a dead mouse in her shoe. She screamed so loud the neighbors called security." The remaining students exchanged looks of pure horror. "Furthermore," Professor Veltar continued, his voice now reaching frequencies that only certain deep space communication arrays could detect, "observe the creature's remarkably flexible spinal column. This predator can literally twist its body into configurations that should be anatomically impossible." The cat chose this moment to demonstrate by twisting around to lick its own back leg, essentially folding itself into what could only be described as a furry pretzel. "Yeah, they're basically made of liquid," Mark confirmed, "and they can fall from pretty much any height and just walk it off. Something about always landing on their feet. Physics just sort of gives up when it comes to cats." At this point, Professor Veltar appeared to be having what could generously be called a controlled academic breakdown. His electromagnetic field was cycling through colors that didn't have names in most languages, and he was making small, whimpering sounds that his species typically reserved for natural disasters. The cat, meanwhile, had gotten bored with the whole educational experience and decided to explore. It hopped down from the desk with fluid grace and began walking toward the huddled students. The panic was immediate and absolute. Chairs overturned, tentacles flailed, and at least 2 students began reciting what sounded suspiciously like last rites. Mark just stood up and followed the cat. "Here, kitty, kitty," he called, completely oblivious to the fact that he was casually pursuing certain death. "Who's a good boy? Yes, you are." The cat looked back at him and mouthed softly. Professor Veltar fainted. What happened next would later be described in academic papers as either the most remarkable interspecies contact event in recorded history or the most terrifying display of human insanity ever documented, depending on who was writing the report. The cat, having apparently decided that Mark was the only reasonable person in a room full of hysterical aliens, approached him with the kind of casual confidence that most species reserve for situations where they weren't surrounded by beings capable of interstellar travel. It stopped directly in front of Mark's feet, looked up at him with those unnervingly large eyes that Professor Veltar had just finished explaining were designed for optimal target acquisition, and began to rub against his legs. "Oh, you're friendly," Mark said, crouching down to get closer to what everyone else considered to be certain death. "Yes, you are. You're such a good kitty." From his position clinging to the ceiling, Zix let out a sound like a deflating balloon animal. "It's marking him," he whispered in horror. "The predator is claiming its prey for later consumption." Kor, who had managed to wedge himself behind an overturned desk that was roughly the size of a small spacecraft, nodded grimly. "Classic hunting behavior. It's establishing territorial dominance before the kill." The cat, completely oblivious to this analysis of its supposedly sinister motives, flopped down on its side and began rolling around on Mark's shoes, exposing its belly in what any human would recognize as the universal sign of feline trust and contentment. The aliens saw it differently. "Dear gods," breathed one of the students who hadn't fled earlier, a crystalline from the Vega system whose natural form resembled living quartz. "It's displaying its primary attack position. Those are all vital strike points." Mark, meanwhile, was making what could only be described as baby talk. "Oh, who's got a fluffy tummy? Is it you? I think it's you." And then, to the absolute horror of everyone present, he reached down and actually touched the cat's stomach. The silence that followed was so complete that you could have heard a pin drop in the next solar system. The cat purred louder and grabbed Mark's hand with its paws, not extending its claws, but simply holding on like a furry, vibrating security blanket. "This is it," Zix whimpered from the ceiling. "This is how we all die, watching a human voluntarily enter the killing embrace of a Deathworld predator." But Mark just laughed and gently scratched the cat's chin. "You like that, don't you? Yes, you do. You're just a big softy, aren't you?" The purring reached a volume that made the classroom's acoustic dampeners struggle to compensate. Professor Veltar, who had regained consciousness just in time to witness this display of apparent suicidal madness, made a sound like a malfunctioning hyperdrive. "Mr. Thompson," he managed to croak, "you are making direct physical contact with a Class 12 Deathworld predator. This goes against every safety protocol in the Galactic Academic Handbook." "Yeah, but look how happy he is," Mark replied, now sitting cross-legged on the floor while the cat climbed into his lap and settled down like it owned the place. "I think he likes me." The cat chose this moment to begin what humans know as making biscuits, kneading its paws against Mark's leg while purring contentedly. "It's tenderizing him," Kor said in a voice that suggested he was witnessing the slow-motion collapse of everything he thought he understood about survival instincts. "Preparing the flesh for consumption." "Actually," Mark said, still scratching behind the cat's ears, "that's called making biscuits. It's what they do when they're happy and comfortable. Cats need things that remind them of their mothers." The collective existential crisis that followed this statement was almost audible. "You're telling me," said the crystalline student, their prismatic form refracting light in patterns that indicated severe psychological distress, "that this killing machine is treating you like its parent?" "More like a friend, I think," Mark replied, as the cat head-butted his chest and then curled up in his lap like a furry, purring loaf of bread. "Cats are pretty good judges of character. This little guy can probably tell I'm not a threat." Zix made a sound like he was trying to process information that simply refused to compute. "But humans are from a death world. You're supposed to be the threat." Mark shrugged, one hand still gently stroking the cat's head. "I mean, we can be pretty dangerous when we need to be, but mostly we just want to pet things and make friends. That's kind of our whole deal." The cat, as if to emphasize this point, stretched one paw up to rest on Mark's chest and began purring so loudly that it activated the classroom's structural vibration alarms. Professor Veltar stared at this scene, his 4 optical sensors trying to process the sight of his most dangerous specimen behaving like a domesticated companion animal with a member of another Deathworld species, and came to the only logical conclusion his academic mind could reach. "I need to update my research," he said faintly. What happened next completely shattered whatever remained of the established academic order in Professor Veltar's classroom. Mark, still sitting on the floor with a purring cat in his lap, looked up at the terrified faces surrounding him, and seemed to have what humans would call a teaching moment. "You know what?" he said, gently shifting the cat so he could stand up while still holding it. "Since you guys seem pretty freaked out about this little dude, maybe I should show you how to actually interact with cats safely." The collective intake of breath from the remaining students sounded like an atmospheric processing plant experiencing catastrophic decompression. "Mr. Thompson," Professor Veltar began, his voice reaching octaves that most species used exclusively for mating calls or territorial disputes, "I absolutely forbid you to demonstrate anything involving direct contact with that creature." Mark looked at him with the kind of patient expression usually reserved for explaining basic concepts to small children. "But you brought him here to teach about predators, right? Wouldn't it be more educational if people actually understood how they work?" The cat, seemingly bored with all the academic discussion, decided to demonstrate its liquid-like properties by flowing out of Mark's arms and onto his shoulder, where it draped itself like a furry, purring scarf. Core, still wedged behind his makeshift fortress, made a sound like grinding metal. "It's positioning itself for a neck strike," he whispered. "Classic ambush predator behavior." "Actually," Mark said, reaching up to scratch the cat behind the ears, "this is called shoulder surfing. Cats like high places because it makes them feel secure. Plus, they're naturally curious, so they want to see what's going on." He began walking slowly around the classroom, the cat perfectly balanced on his shoulder like they'd been doing this routine for years. "See? Cats have incredible balance and coordination. This guy could probably walk a tightrope if he wanted to." The students followed his movement with the kind of horrified fascination usually reserved for watching stellar phenomena that might destroy entire solar systems. "Now, the key thing to understand about cats," Mark continued, his voice taking on the tone of someone giving a nature documentary, "is that they're actually incredibly social animals. They just show it differently than, say, dogs." He paused near Zix, who was still clinging to the ceiling and had turned a shade of purple that definitely wasn't in the normal Glorbonian color spectrum. "For instance, when a cat slow blinks at you, that's basically their way of saying they trust you. It's like a kitty kiss." To demonstrate, Mark looked up at the cat and deliberately closed his eyes in a slow, exaggerated blink. The cat, as if it had been waiting for exactly this cue, returned the gesture with the kind of deliberate precision that suggested it was following some sort of ancient feline protocol. "Sweet cosmic void," breathed the crystalline student, their form now refracting light in patterns that hurt to look at directly. "They're communicating through synchronized optical shutdown sequences." "Or winking," Mark said cheerfully. "We call it winking." Professor Veltar was now making notes on his tablet with the kind of frantic energy that suggested he was either documenting the most significant xenobiological discovery in galactic history or writing his own obituary. "The human appears to have established some form of non-verbal communication protocol with the specimen," he muttered. Mark, meanwhile, had moved on to what he clearly considered basic cat handling techniques. "Now, if you want to pet a cat, you start with areas they're comfortable with. Top of the head, behind the ears, under the chin." He demonstrated each area, and the cat's purring increased in volume with each touch. "You avoid the belly unless they specifically invite you to touch it, and you never grab the tail." The cat stretched and repositioned itself more comfortably on Mark's shoulder, its tail swishing gently near his face. "Designed specifically to harm," Ralph said, and Professor Veltar said, consulting his notes with the desperate intensity of someone trying to solve a quantum mechanics problem while falling into a black hole. "According to our behavioral analysis, indicates aggressive intent." "Nah," Mark replied, gently catching the cat's tail as it swished by, and giving it a soft stroke, which only made the purring louder. "That's just happy tail swishing. If he were actually upset, his tail would be all puffed up and bottle-brushy. Plus, his ears would be back, and he'd probably be hissing." To illustrate the difference, Mark made a soft hissing sound. The cat looked at him with what could only be described as mild disapproval, and murrowed softly, as if to say, "That's not how you do it, human." "See?" Mark laughed. "He's basically telling me I'm doing it wrong." At this point, one of the braver students, a Matharian who resembled a cross between a praying mantis and a philosophy professor, tentatively raised one of his forearms. "Mr. Thompson," he said, his voice carrying the kind of careful respect usually reserved for addressing known explosives. "Are you suggesting that this creature is capable of corrective social interaction?" "Oh, absolutely," Mark nodded, now allowing the cat to rub its face against his cheek in what the aliens were probably interpreting as some form of territorial marking ritual, but was actually just standard feline affection. "Cats are way smarter than most people give them credit for. They learn routines, remember faces, form emotional attachments. This guy probably knows it's class time and that you're all students." The cat chose this moment to look directly at the Matharian student and emit a soft mistral that sounded almost conversational. The student nearly fell off his chair. "It acknowledged me," he whispered. "The Deathworld predator just acknowledged my existence." "He's saying hello," Mark translated. "Cats are actually pretty polite when they want to be." Professor Veltar looked up from his notes, his electromagnetic field now cycling through colors that suggested either deep scientific fascination or complete psychological breakdown. "Mr. Thompson," he said slowly, "are you telling me that your species has developed a functional social relationship with these predators?" "Well, yeah," Mark said, as if this were the most obvious thing in the universe. "We've been living with cats for like thousands of years. They help us with pest control, we give them food and shelter and belly rubs. It's a pretty good deal for everyone involved. The silence that followed was the kind of profound quiet that usually preceded either great revelations or the complete collapse of established scientific paradigms. Thousands of years? Zix finally managed to whisper from his ceiling perch. At least, Mark confirmed. Some people think it might be more like 10,000. Cats basically domesticated themselves. They figured out that hanging around humans meant easy access to food and warm places to sleep, so they just moved in and made themselves at home. The cat, as if to emphasize this point, yawned broadly, showing off its impressive collection of teeth, then settled more comfortably on Mark's shoulder and closed its eyes. It's entering a dormant state, Professor Veltar observed, his voice barely audible. He's taking a nap, Mark corrected gently. Cats sleep like 16 hours a day. They're basically professional sleepers with a part-time job as hunters. Kor finally emerged from behind his desk fortress, moving with the careful precision of someone who wasn't entirely sure he wasn't dreaming. You keep saying hunters, he said, but this creature appears to be completely docile. Mark grinned and looked up at the sleeping cat on his shoulder. Oh, he's definitely still a hunter. All cats are. But the thing about cats is, they hunt because it's fun and they're good at it, not because they have to. When they're well-fed and comfortable, they're basically just furry roommates who occasionally bring you dead things as presents. The existential implications of this statement hit the remaining students like a metaphysical freight train, traveling at light speed. Professor Veltar, his academic composure hanging by a thread thinner than a quantum string, managed to steady himself against his desk and clear his throat. Mr. Thompson, he said, his voice carrying the weight of someone who had just watched everything he thought he knew about xenobiology crumble into cosmic dust. I find myself compelled to ask a question that may fundamentally alter our understanding of Deathworld's species adaptation strategies. Mark adjusted his position slightly to better support the napping cat on his shoulder. Sure, shoot. Are there, Professor Veltar paused, as if the words themselves might trigger some sort of universal catastrophe, other predators that your species has established these domestic partnerships with? The smile that spread across Mark's face was the kind of expression that, in another context, might have been reassuring. In this particular moment, it had roughly the same effect as watching a supernova form in real time. Oh man, tons of them, Mark said with the casual enthusiasm of someone discussing their favorite hobby. I mean, cats are just the beginning. We've got dogs, which are basically domesticated wolves, birds of prey like hawks and eagles, sometimes even owls. Some people keep snakes, lizards, even spiders. The classroom had gone so quiet that the ambient hum of the life support systems sounded like a roaring waterfall. Did you just say, Zix whispered from his ceiling perch, his gelatinous form now a color that didn't exist in any known spectrum, domesticated wolves? Oh, yeah, dogs are the best, Mark continued, completely oblivious to the fact that he was systematically destroying the sanity of everyone present. They're way more social than cats. Super loyal, great with kids, excellent security systems. My neighbor back home has this German shepherd named Rex, who's basically the size of a small horse and could probably bite through titanium, but he's also afraid of butterflies and likes to sleep on the couch. Kor made a sound like a structural support beam giving way under excessive pressure. You keep creatures capable of biting through titanium in your living spaces? Well, not all dogs are that big, Mark said reasonably. Some are tiny. My cousin has this Chihuahua that weighs maybe 3 pounds, but it thinks it's a wolf and will absolutely fight anything that moves. Chihuahuas are basically concentrated rage, in a bite-sized package. Professor Veltar was now writing notes with the kind of desperate intensity that suggested he was either documenting the most comprehensive xenobiological survey in galactic history, or composing a letter of resignation to the universe itself. And the aerial predators, the crystalline student managed to ask, their prismatic form now refracting light in patterns that seemed to suggest they were having an out-of-body experience. Oh, falconry is super cool, Mark said, his eyes lighting up. Humans have been hunting with birds of prey for thousands of years too. You get a hawk or a falcon, train it to hunt with you, and then it comes back because it wants to. It's like having a flying missile that decides to be your friend. The Matharian student raised one trembling appendage. And you mentioned spiders? Yeah, some people are really into tarantulas, Mark nodded. They're actually pretty chill pets. Very low maintenance. Though I'll admit, spiders aren't for everyone. My aunt had this Chilean rose-hair tarantula named Fluffy that was basically the size of a dinner plate. Sweetest thing you ever saw, but definitely not a beginner pet. At this point, Zix lost his grip on the ceiling and landed on the floor with a sound like a water balloon hitting pavement. He didn't get back up. But honestly, Mark continued, as if he wasn't systematically causing multiple species to question everything they thought they knew about survival instincts. The really impressive stuff is when people keep the big predators. There's this guy back on Earth who runs a sanctuary for retired circus animals, and he's got lions and tigers and bears that he hand-raised from cubs. They're basically giant, deadly house cats who could absolutely tear him apart, but instead they play fetch and take naps in the sun. Professor Veltar's electromagnetic field had now cycled through so many colors that it was approaching what could only be described as played. "Mr. Thompson," he said, his voice barely a whisper, "are you telling me that members of your species voluntarily cohabitate with creatures that could kill them instantly, and these creatures choose not to because of affection?" "Well, when you put it like that, it sounds kind of weird," Mark admitted, reaching up to gently pet the still sleeping cat on his shoulder. "But yeah, that's pretty much how it works. I think it's because we're social creatures too, you know? We like having friends, even if those friends happen to have big teeth and claws." The silence that followed was the kind of profound quiet that usually preceded either enlightenment or the complete heat death of the universe. Finally, the Metharian student spoke up, his voice carrying the weight of someone who had just glimpsed the fundamental absurdity of existence. "What about your neighbor with the German Shepherd? What other creatures does your neighborhood contain?" Mark's face brightened even more, which everyone had previously assumed was impossible. "Oh, Mrs. Patterson down the street has a python named Samantha. She's about 12 feet long and absolutely gorgeous. Really friendly, too. Likes to drape herself around your shoulders like a living scarf." The cat on Mark's shoulder chose this moment to wake up, stretch, and mister softly, as if commenting on the conversation. "Then there's the Johnsons. They've got this African gray parrot that's smarter than most college students and has a vocabulary of like 300 words, mostly swear words because Mr. Johnson used to be in the military. And old Pete at the end of the block has a couple of ferrets that are basically chaos incarnate, with fur." Professor Veltar looked down at his notes, then at Mark, then at the cat, then back at his notes. "Mr. Thompson," he said slowly, "based on what you're describing, it appears that your species has essentially turned survival into a recreational activity." "Ah," Mark said, considering this. "I never thought about it like that, but I guess you're right. We do tend to make friends with things that probably should eat us." The cat stretched again and began purring, a sound that now seemed less like a death rattle and more like the universe's way of laughing at the cosmic joke that was human existence. "You know what's really funny?" Mark added, as if the situation needed any additional absurdity. "I actually miss my dog back home. Rex and this guy would probably get along great." Core emerged fully from his desk fortress, moving like someone in a dream. "What," he said carefully, "is a dog like?" Mark's grin could have powered a small space station. "Oh, you'd love dogs. They're basically domesticated wolves, but friendlier and more loyal. And way more energetic. Rex could probably run for about 6 hours straight, and then want to play fetch." The collective realization that hit the room was almost tangible. These humans didn't just coexist with one type of deadly predator. They had systematically befriended entire categories of creatures that should have eliminated them from existence. Professor Veltar set down his tablet, walked to his desk, opened a drawer, pulled out a bottle of something that was probably not approved for consumption by his species, and took a long drink. "Class dismissed," he announced, "forever." Mark looked around at the stunned faces of his classmates and shrugged. "Same time next week?" he asked hopefully. The cat on his shoulder purred louder, as if laughing at the greatest joke in the known universe. Humans had looked at a galaxy full of predators and decided that what they really needed was more friends.